Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Chloe Doherty, Communications Associate of the Florida Springs Council. Thank you all for joining the Florida Springs Council's live post-session recap. This recap will be led by Ryan Smart, the Executive Director of the Florida Springs Council, and he is joined by Bob Palmer, one of FSC's board members who helps direct our legislative advocacy. Before we begin, we will leave time at the end to answer some questions from the audience. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, though, by leaving comments on Facebook or YouTube. If you're joining my Instagram, we will do our best to monitor those comments, but it is easier for us to see what's coming in from Facebook and YouTube. And you can leave comments throughout the presentation, but Bob and Ryan will mostly be answering comments after the end of the slides. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who has participated throughout session, responding to our calls to action. I'm sure you will all hear how much of a difference and impact it has made. And I appreciate everyone who engages online, sends emails, and contacts legislators. And Ryan, on to you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And thanks to everyone for being here. We're going to go through some of the bills that were a priority to the Florida Springs Council tonight, and bills of specific importance to Springs. We're going to talk about what those bills would have done, as well as a little bit about the advocacy work that us and our colleagues and our members did throughout this session. I think big picture, there wasn't a whole lot of great stuff to celebrate this session passing, but we were able to stop a lot of the very worst bills. And there were a couple good things and still some work left to be done. So with that, we'll jump into it. Next slide. So starting session, the Florida Springs Council's #1 priority was defeating House Bill 789, Senate Bill 738, despite the kind of generic title of environmental resources. When this bill was filed, it actually had 4 components. The first would have made fee shifting for environmental challenges law in Florida. And what fee shifting essentially means is that the loser would have to pay in any challenge to an environmental permit or action by the Department of Environmental Protection or by any of the water management districts. Of course, this gets to environmental resource permitting, consumptive use permitting, and very possible rule adoption. The second would have changed the stormwater side slopes. That was something to help prevent drowning that we did not oppose. The third provision was strict liability of lawsuits, limiting those lawsuits to only personal property. So it would not cover issues like damages to health. And the fourth was a overhaul of coastal permitting in Florida, which would have easier potentially for inappropriate redevelopment following storms in our coastal areas. And this was especially important to the Florida Springs Council because of that first provision, the fee shift for environmental challenges. One of the things that the Florida Springs Council specializes in, and we've had a lot of success with, is filing administrative challenges against the state of Florida, specifically on our basin management action plans. You want to talk a little bit about that, Bob?
Sure. So, yeah, as Ryan said, this bill would have been really a dagger at the heart of FSC and some other environmental groups. FSC is really one of the few groups left in the state that actually sues the state to try to compel the state to follow the law, which, as you know, many of us know they don't always do. We've actually, in the last year, had 2 lawsuits where we were upheld by the First District Court of Appeals, and they ruled against rulings by DOA on a couple of our suits. So we've had some good successes, but we also have the threat of lawsuits, which is really important. I think state agencies now know that we're not afraid to engage in legal action. And that's been very helpful in a couple of cases that I can think of. One was several years ago when DeSantis first won. He was taking forever to appoint members to water management district boards. And that was something that we could bring legal action on. And I think we basically forced them to fill some of the boards. We didn't necessarily like the folks that were appointed, none of which really had environmental or scientific credentials, but at least we forced them to follow the law. Another one is this bill, and I think Ryan can explain probably why this bill died, thanks to threats of lawsuits on our end. So anyway, and Ryan mentioned the BMAP case, and I'll just say base management action plans are the primary means for effectuating water quality improvements in the state of Florida. And we brought the first suit in the state against BMAPs, against 5 of the springs BMAPs, which covered about 15 outstanding Florida springs, which were impaired. And here we are 4 or 5 years later. That suit is still active, but we got a very favorable ruling a year ago from the First District Court of Appeals, which DEP continues to ignore. So we're continuing to pursue that suit at the price of considerable effort and money on our end. But we're confident in the end we're going to win that. And you know, even with those threats of suits and the suits we've had, there's a list of other things that we can challenge that we, you know, if anybody's on this call from DEP or Water Management District, rest assured we're looking at every possibility for trying to get you guys to enforce the law. So we do have a list that we may pursue. You know, once these current cases are resolved, there's always challenges, legal challenges with the state of Florida.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So back to this bill specifically, working with some of our legal friends, you know, one of the things we identified was that the EPA had published a draft rule that would have prohibited fee shifting for any states that had assumed federal permitting. And as many of you are probably aware, a couple of years ago, the state took over wetlands dredge and fill permitting from the federal government, and this rule would have specifically applied to that permitting. So we were able to get up during the committees and testify about the concerns, not only that the bill would have on us, but essentially threatened to go to court to overturn the state's 404 permitting assumption. Since then, a group of litigants have actually won a victory when it comes to permitting on Endangered Species Act, where there could be a possible taking, but that still leaves about 85% of permits that could still be covered by the state. And if they're not going to follow the rules, which in many cases they don't, they really shouldn't have the ability to issue those permits that require federal oversight. So on top of you know, our lobbying internally and our ability to raise those 404 issues, which no one else was raising, we also got enormous support from our members. And one of the tactics that we used on this bill specifically was to target Chair Cindy Stevenson in the House. The way that the legislature works, because the one party has a supermajority in both chambers, typically the committees are so lopsided that once a bill is up in committee, it can be very hard to stop. We were able to generate hundreds and thousands, I think, actually, of emails and phone calls directly to the chair of the first committee in the House, asking her not to agenda the bill. And because of that outreach, she agreed that if she was going to agenda the bill, essentially they would need to cut both the fee shifting and the coastal permitting sections from the bill. So right from that first House committee meeting, we had kind of 2 of the more onerous sections removed from the bill. Then we were able to keep up that advocacy in the Senate to get the Senate to conform their bill to the House bill. Going into the last week or 2 weeks of session, the bill did not include the fee shifting and it did not include coastal permitting, but it still did have the potentially concerning strict liability change to limit that to only private property. Fortunately, by the end of session, this bill, even though it was able to pass its committees, it was not taken up in the House and Senate. Therefore, you know, it did not pass. I think we'll probably see something like this again next year, but hopefully we'll be in a good position to try to stop it, especially with, you know, this 404 hammer kind of hanging over their head. So, you know, as Bob talks about various areas of litigation we're looking into, you know, one of those is trying to look at whether or not it'd be possible without the fee shifting provision, or if they were to bring this back next year to overturn the state assumption of federal 404 permitting. Anything else you want to add on that, Bob?
Nope, that's it. Thank you.
All right, next slide, Chloe. So once we kind of had 789 and 738 under control, we really shifted our attention to auxiliary containers. This bill has a very interesting history. This is basically how the state deals with packaging. Back in 2019, the legislature passed a law that preempted local governments from enacting new regulations on packaging, single-use plastics, things like that, but kept the existing regulations the local governments had already passed and regulations that were in place in state parks active. And for springs, this is really important. Ichitucknee has a ban on single-use containers on the river, but Weeki Wachee has a ban on single-use containers. But Rainbow River specifically has a ban from the state park, a ban in the city of Dunellen, and a ban from Marion County. So you had 3 bans, one state, one municipal, and one county, all working together to protect the river. Which is, really important for anyone who's been on a river that has one of these bans versus one that doesn't. There's a big difference. I know a group that I volunteered with in the past collected over 10,000 pounds of trash off the Santa Fe, which does not have one of these ordinances, but only about 150 pounds of trash off the Rainbow. So these ordinances, they're important, they work. In 2019, as part of that bill, the state required the Department of Environmental Protection to do a study and create recommendations for the legislature to enact for how to handle what is a very serious issue. The department did the study, and they had a list of recommendations. Republican lawmaker in the House actually filed a bill to enact those regulations for several years in a row, and that bill could not get a committee hearing. So this year, Representative Yeager and Senator Martin came out with a bill that essentially said, well, we're not going to do anything. And we're not only going to keep the preemptions that we already had in place, but we're going to remove the existing protections that exist in state parks and local governments. That was a huge concern for us and our partners like Ichitucknee and the Rainbow and the Weeki Wachee. So we decided that this would be a bill that we would really focus on. We had a unique opportunity where the bill was to be heard in the Community Affairs Committee, which was 4-3, 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. We had a pretty good sense that we had the 3 Democrats' votes, but you obviously need one more vote. And we were able to identify a champion on this issue, Senator Jennifer Bradley, who has some more outstanding Florida Springs in her district than any other legislator, and also is a big champion of Florida's state parks. And we were able to generate many, many emails and calls to Senator Bradley, and you can see that that picture there on the screen. We had more than 15 people come up to Tallahassee the day the bill was to be heard. We were able to meet with Senator Bradley's staff, who were very gracious and let us have a lot of their time to tell, relay to the senator what our concerns were. And we managed to have enough votes that the sponsor chose to temporarily postpone the bill in the Senate. Temporarily postponed means they could bring it up later, but it was the last committee meeting for that committee, so we felt pretty good about that. We were then able to go to the House and basically, since the bill wasn't moving in the Senate, apply a lot of pressure to the House committee, again, generating hundreds of emails on this to that committee, asking them to not pass the bill. Once again, the bill was postponed in that committee and it ended up not being heard again for the rest of session, which means it died. Overall, Florida Springs Council members were able to generate over 5,000 emails just this legislative session to oppose these bills. And, we heard from legislators directly that made a big difference. I mean, I think these bills would probably be law if it wasn't for the thousands and thousands of people that reached out and contacted their legislators and let them know how it would personally affect them. This issue will also probably be back, but hopefully it will be back with a bill that will actually allow local governments to pass regulations or, a state regulation that would be statewide that would help address these issues. For us, it is absolutely key that the spring state parks and local governments that have springs and spring rivers running through them continue to be able to pass new regulations because we know they work. And the state does not provide any funding to essentially go clean this stuff up. It really falls on local groups and nonprofits. So, we really need the local governments and to be able to do these. And I mean, how ridiculous it would be would it be if a state park couldn't limit single-use plastics within the park? That really showed the press and legislators that this bill was, way too much overreach. Was not a good idea. We're very happy we were able to kill this one. We worked really closely with our coastal partners, specifically Surfrider, on this. This is typically thought of as a coastal issue because it is mostly coastal local governments that have put these regulations in place. The city of Hollywood has a very strong regulation. Some of the cities down in Miami-Dade County have strong regulations, but they weren't able to identify quite as strong of a champion as Senator Bradley. So we really owe a huge debt of gratitude to Senator Bradley for making sure this did not become law this session. Anything you'd like to add, Bob?
Carry on, sir.
All right, next slide, please. All right, and then this was one of the bills that I was most concerned about when it was filed. It did not have a House companion. It was only filed in the Senate. This is the surplus lands bill, and this would have allowed the Department of Environmental Protection to surplus any conservation lands purchased within the Florida Wildlife Corridor, take out the development rights, but then sell those lands to agriculture, which could clear cut them, level them, and do as intensive agriculture as they wanted. One of the biggest problems with this bill was that it went around a very effective and long-standing process the state has for surplusing lands. When a land is purchased for conservation, for it to be surplused, first, the department has to go out and they have to look at the land, and they have to find that it has no conservation value. Then that decision goes to the Acquisition and Restoration Council, which has to have a finding that there's no conservation value, and then it has to be approved by the cabinet. And because of all that oversight, we really haven't had controversial land sales on lands purchased with state money. This would have bypassed all of that and allowed the department, even where the land had significant conservation value, to sell it and put it back into agriculture. And, we're not just talking about lands that were previously in agriculture. We're talking about pristine lands, pristine forests that could then be clear cut. Since, agriculture is the major source of pollution to Florida Springs, if we had, we need to be doing everything we can to reduce agricultural pollution, not increase it. Bob, you want to add anything?
Just expand briefly the last thing you said there, Ryan, about ag being a principal source of pollution to springs. Certainly in North Florida, I'm thinking the Santa Fe Basin Management Action Plan, the Suwannee Basin Management Action Plan. DEP's own figures show that agriculture is responsible for 70 to 80, some cases even more than 80% of the nitrogen reaching groundwater in those Basin Management Action Plan areas. So adding more is not going to be helpful. And on top of that, DAX, the State Agriculture Agency, does a report every year on their projections for agriculture, I guess county by county. And the projections are in those areas I just mentioned in North Florida, the Santa Fe area, the Suwannee area, and there are other areas. Agricultural irrigation is projected to increase significantly over the next 20 years. Irrigation increases, fertilizer increases. You don't irrigate if you're not putting fertilizer down. So, yeah, we've already got an issue of ag being the principal source of nitrate to the groundwater in these areas. And the fact that it's projected to grow anyway. And I think the last thing the springs need is clear cutting forests and putting in more ag. That's not productive.
Absolutely. So this bill never received a committee hearing, but it was filed as an amendment onto the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services bill. Late in session, this was a late filed amendment that kind of popped up overnight for a bill that was supposed to be heard early in the morning, which at that point, really, we were the only group that was able to do any action on it. But we were very Travis Moore, who represents the Defenders of Wildlife and the Florida Native Plant Society, was able to use some of the calls and emails that we generated to get with the sponsor and express our serious concern over the amendment. And the sponsor withdrew the amendment before it was heard in committee. And then this was not put on any other bills or heard again, but this is a priority of Agricultural Commissioner Wilton Simpson. So it's something that I feel pretty certain will pop back up next year. If there's one proposal that we need to really oppose, it's this. I mean, you can't remove enough septic tanks. You can't upgrade enough wastewater treatment facilities. You can't pass enough fertilizer ordinances to undo the damage that would be done if we began to convert massive amounts of forests into intensive agriculture. So this is something that I think we will be working on and trying to oppose for years to come. But it was really, good that we were able to stop it this year. We need to keep buying more land. We need to keep de-intensifying agriculture, not turning forests into row crops. Next slide. With all that negative, this is a very good bill that did pass this year. This is House Bill 1417, Senate Bill 1638, funding for environmental resource management. As some of you are aware, within the last year, sports betting became legal in Florida, which was going to greatly increase the amount of revenue that went into the same Seminole Gaming Compact. There was a question of how that money would be spent. And the House and Senate both deserve a lot of credit for deciding that money should go to environmental projects. So what this bill does is it dedicates 96% of the revenue payments from the Seminole Gaming Compact to environmental resources. And that's going to work out to 26% for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, approximately $100 million a year, which includes acquisition, easement, land management, and payment for environmental services. And that is a potentially very good thing where the state could be providing additional funding to agricultural producers to de-intensify, to go from row crops to pine, to grow less intensive crops without it impacting their bottom line. So that's a great thing. It also 26% or $100 million for land management. The state has great land management needs. The more land we acquire, the more money we need to manage it. This land management funding goes to state parks, local trails, state forests, and wildlife management areas. As someone who is an avid hiker and camper, we need this funding to upkeep our trails. The trail systems in Florida are amazing and they're extensive. And a lot of the on-the-ground work is done by volunteers, but there's some things that, you just need money for. And this will be an ongoing revenue source every year during the gaming compact to take care of that. And then it puts 26% or $100 million into the Resilient Florida Trust Fund. This is for coastal resiliency projects to deal with sea level rise and flooding. And finally, the remainder, which this year comes out to $79 million, but will likely grow in future years as the gaming compact receives more and more money, will go to the Water Quality Improvement Grant Program. And that's something that we lobbied for. When the bill was originally filed, they wanted to put this money, the bill proposed putting this money into the state revolving loan fund for water supply. So it would have been used for water supply projects, which are often used to fuel development. As opposed to conserve land. The Water Quality Improvement Grant Program was amended last year as part of House Bill 1309 to include land conservation and agricultural projects. Again, getting back to the most important things that we can do to protect our springs. But there's always been a question of how would we fund that program. So this is going to be an ongoing revenue source that essentially projects that are within the Basin Management Action Plan can apply for, and based on their benefit and cost effectiveness, they can be funded through this project. So we were very, very excited to see this bill pass this year and to have, a considerable amount of money, $379 million for this year, which will probably go up, go into environmental resource protection. You want to add anything, Bob?
I just want to thank you, Ryan, for your contribution to this program through your sports betting activities.
I'm sure he's joking. Next slide. And finally, a bill that is, a bill that is still active, and that we are currently calling for a veto on, House Bill 87, Senate Bill 632, taking of bears by Representative Schoaf and Senator Simon. This bill did pass. What this bill does is, right now, clearly, if you're threatened by a bear, you have the right to defend yourself. There's never been a situation where anyone has been arrested in the state of Florida for defending themselves from a bear. And this is, managed by the Florida Wildlife Commission, which does a very good job. They are, if anybody lives in bear country, they are out in the communities. If there are nuisance bears, they trap them and they attempt to relocate them. While we do have, some areas where there are too many human interactions with bears, that's really primarily because of human activities, particularly how we manage our trash. And one of the reasons that this bill is worth opposing is that it largely comes from Franklin County. And in the year 2024, Franklin County still does not have trash pickup. So it seemed like a very, misguided step to allow folks to shoot bears, threatening people, but for also threatening property, right? So if a bear is on your property and you feel like it was going to, threaten it, you would be allowed to kill that bear, and then you would have 24 hours before that would be reported to FWC. There was some very concerning testimony on this bill. It was strongly supported by the hunting community, which has nothing to do with protecting people or property. We also heard, two stories that really stuck out to me. One of them was about a gentleman who had 400 pounds of corn that he put out in his yard, and the bear came. And his belief was that he should be allowed to keep 400 pounds of corn in his yard. And if the bear comes to, get the corn, he should be able to shoot it. Well, that's bear baiting. I mean, that's bear baiting, plain and simple. There's no other explanation for it. The other story was about a sheriff's officer with 12 years experience who was called out to deal with a nuisance bear. The bear did not respond to loud noises, did not respond to anything. So the sheriff's officer unloaded his handgun at the bear. He fired 18 rounds, 3 of which hit the bear, and the other 15 of which went wherever those bullets wanted to go. And it's one thing in Franklin County, which is a very rural county, to be emptying your weapon out into the sky. But of course, bears don't just exist in Franklin County. You can go where we were this weekend down in Seminole County, and you can see lots of bear interactions in neighborhoods crowded with people. And because you have 24 hours to report, it's not hard to imagine someone who's been sitting around, having several drinks throughout the evening, sees a bear in their property, grabs their gun, runs out, and just begins winging shots at it, despite the fact in the middle of a neighborhood. So, our concern on this bill, is not only that we'll see bears killed that do not need to be killed, but also that it endangers public safety. And, just personally, I love springs, but I also love forests. And one of the things that I love most about springs is that you can't protect a spring by putting a fence around it. You want to protect a tree, you want to protect a mountain, you just put a fence around it. Springs don't work that way. To protect the springs, we have to protect the forests. We have to deal with the land around them. And the forests are where I spend my favorite time. I can't wait to get out in the forest this weekend. Part of being in the forest is getting to see these animals. And I have seen countless numbers of bears and never felt threatened, never had a bad experience. We have infringed on their habitat. And at the very least we can do is to lock up our trash and not put 400-pound bags of corn in our yard to attract them. So an alternative to this bill, which was also approved in the legislative session, is $685,000 for bear-resistant trash cans in Franklin County. We think it would be a much better public policy for the state to allocate that money, which essentially is enough to buy every household in Franklin County a bear-proof trash can, and see how that works before we just make it open season on bears when they're, in our neighborhoods just passing through. There's a link in the chat, and Chloe also put the link up on the screen there for a minute. I will say, this veto request is very active. I know for a fact it's being seriously considered by the governor's office. There's the link there. And this is something that, we have a real chance of stopping this year, and at least giving it a chance for those trash programs to work. So if it hasn't, I strongly urge you to take action on this. You have an advocacy system. It's a good advocacy system. It makes this all very easy. Email the governor, call the governor, let him know that you oppose House Bill 87, and support the appropriation of funds for bear-proof trash cans in Franklin County. All right, next slide. Appropriations. Bob, you want to talk a little bit about appropriations?
Well, let's go to the slides. I think that sentence says it all. It's the clearest expression of the legislature's priorities.
All right, there we go.
That's where they're spending their constituents' dollars. So, yeah, let's carry on, I think.
Got it. So for this year, the Springs are receiving $55 million. The state minimum under law is $50 million. That's what it was at in the budget all year. We were fortunate that Speaker Renner put $5 million extra from his supplemental funding, which we do appreciate, but that is nowhere near enough to even make a dent in the problems related to Springs restoration. If you look at the number of septic tanks that DEP says needs to be removed in just the Rainbow Basin, and you look at what DEP says the cost of replacing those septic tanks are, or hooking them up to central sewer, just the Rainbow Basin is going to take $3 to $4 billion, and that's just for septic tanks. And septic tanks are not even the largest source of pollution for Rainbow. So $55 million is really a drop in the bucket. It's not even enough to hold the status quo. And that's why, we see that Springs Health is getting worse, not better. By contrast, Everglades restoration this year received over $855 million. And that is a huge inequity in funding. And what it really comes down to is, it is a massive, folks in Central and North Florida are funding Everglades restoration in South Florida. And one of the big problems with the way Everglades restoration in South Florida is being done is that it's primarily large infrastructure projects that are, in a lot of ways, water supply projects. So when we look at, why is there this big discrepancy in funding? Does the legislature just hate Springs? No, I don't think that's it at all. But when we look at the kind of projects that get funded through Everglades restoration, they're construction projects. They're massive reservoirs, they're stormwater treatment areas, they're canals. There are engineering firms, construction firms, and all kinds of other businesses that do a lot of lobbying that end up on the receiving end of these funds. You can't fix a spring that way because of the way that the hydrogeology up here in Central and North Florida works. You can't capture the pollution after it's on the ground. You pour some pollution on the ground here in Florida, whatever is not taken up by the soil or the plants is going to end up in our aquifer. And whatever ends up in our aquifer is going to come out of spring. And whatever comes out of spring is going to go into a river. You want to add to that, Bob?
Yeah, briefly. Yeah, as you said, the minimum funding that goes to Springs is $50 million a year. And that was a provision that was adopted, I guess, in the mid-2010s when there was a group of 5 senators who were really strong on Springs. I think Senator Dean had a big role in this $50 million minimum. And so that's been going on for a decade. And, that adds up to $500 million or so, which sounds like a lot. But, of course, in that time period, if you look at water quality in the Springs, and there's a report on the FSC website on this. Water quality is indicated by nitrate pollution, which is what the state looks at, DEP looks at in their BMAPs, is actually generally getting worse. So, yeah, it's I don't want to diminish the fact that we've gotten $500 million over a decade, and that's good, but it's clearly, as Ryan said, with the Rainbow situation, it's clearly not enough. What we're going to have to do to really make a dent, in addition to the septic tank issue, is land purchases and conservation easements for agriculture. And, there are examples of this. There was one that was just signed, I think it was in Gilchrist County, where Alachua Conservation Trust was involved with Stetson and Suwannee District and Dax and they're paying a farmer to convert from intensive row cropping to pasture land over a period of a decade. That'll make a difference. And we're going to need a lot of those. And most farmers are not going to do them willingly. They're going to have to be paid to change their practices. So that's going to require much more than $50 million a year when we're looking at 24 impaired Florida springs. We have 30 outstanding Florida springs. 24 of them are impaired and require restoration. So yeah, the 50 million, I hate to say it's a joke, but it's basically a joke. We need much, much more, and the programs need to be really targeted to where they really will make a difference.
Right. And when the DEP was proposing its budget and proposing $50 million a year for springs, legislators in the House and Senate both spoke up and said, well, why only $50 million? Why not more? And Secretary Hamilton told them that that's all we needed. And that is completely, that's ridiculous. And it's incorrect in a way that's hard to fathom. That the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection would be telling the legislature that springs only need $50 million a year, when DEP is very well aware that our spring health continues to decline. And our states really made a policy choice when it comes to how we manage environmental resources. And that policy choice is to deal with environmental problems not through regulation, but through funding. And if that's the choice they're going to make, which I disagree with, but if that is the choice they're going to make, then they need to provide enough funding to actually get something done. And $55 million is nowhere near the amount. Springs restoration should be what Everglades restoration is, right? And there's plenty of money in the budget. Not advocating for reducing the Everglades restoration funding, but we have a budget of over $100 billion. As you'll see later on, there's lots of things receiving way, way more than $55 million, specifically local water infrastructure projects and water supply projects. So the money's there. Again, it just comes back to what they prioritize. There's really no way to address springs pollution without reducing pollution at the source. And I think that, we really need to, identify some champions in the upcoming legislative session to at least bump that number up to a minimum of $150 million a year, which, it will at least allow us to make some progress. There's a lot of projects that are not being done simply because there's not enough money going to springs to do them. All right, next slide. Another very disappointing number was $100 million for Florida Forever. If there's anything that I think is more important than that springs protection number, it is that Florida Forever number. Because the best thing we can do for our springs is to conserve lands. It's the best thing we can do for our environment anywhere. $100 million is also the minimum allowable under state law for Florida Forever. Historically, that program received $300 million a year. But that was some 10 years ago, where $300 million then was a lot more than $300 million now. Rural and family and lands easement also received $100 million a year. This is one that the legislature disagreed on, was originally proposed at $300 million in one chamber and $100 million in the other. We were disappointed to see that the $100 million figure won out. And then finally, Florida Communities Trust, which is used for parks. Received $15 million, which is higher than what had been originally in the budget, and we're very happy to see that money spent well. Land management received $28 million, and I think if you look at how low that number is, you'll see how important that $100 million that's going to be coming from the gaming compact is. And there was $4 million for reforestation. Anything you want to add, Bob?
Carry on, Ryan.
All right, next slide. Other major appropriations, just to touch on them quickly, sea level resiliency received $125 million. TMDLs, that's total maximum daily loads. That is how they calculate how much pollution a water body can withstand before it is impaired, received $25 million. $15 million for the harmful algal blooms and the blue-green algae task force. As you can see, $55 million, as much for springs for alternative water supply projects. Individual water projects. So these are the projects that are proposed by legislators within their district. $410 million, $75 million in the River Lagoon, $39 million for Caloosahatchee, $35 million for cost share in agricultural and best management practices. That can be a good thing. And $3.5 billion for the development of minimum flows and levels. Right now, the department is working on the Santa Fe MFL and the Wekiva MFL. And this will go towards funding some of that work. Next slide. And finally, projects of interest. So I'm going to spend most of my time here on those on the top four. The Groveland Reservoir was something that appeared in the budget kind of at the very last minute, and it is $400 million. And if you all remember, around about 10 years ago, the state did something called the Central Florida Water Initiative, which was designed to allow a development of a city the size of Orlando, just to the southeast of Orlando on former Deseret cattle land. The big problem with that development was that there was no water for the development. They had a long rulemaking process that developed the Central Florida Water Initiative rules. In the legislative session during ratification, a lot of those rules were rewritten by developers to be much more favorable to development. One of our biggest criticisms of that program was it basically minimized water conservation and maximized water supply development. And that's what this Groveland Reservoir project is. It's a $400 million reservoir to push water north in along the St. Johns to feed development within the Central Florida Water Initiative planning area. It is projected to provide 136 million gallons a day of water, which should give you a sense of the size of the development that they're planning. The legislature has actually been pushing this as land conservation funding, which is super ironic, considering it's going to lead to the destruction of a lot of undeveloped land. But, again, when you think about all the scrutiny that goes into some relatively small appropriations, this was snuck in at the last minute. I have to assume that was intentional. This will, lead to big problems. It'll lead to big problems in that area, big problems for the springs around Orange and Volusia counties. And it's something that we'll be tracking very closely. The next item down is the Florida Gulf Coast University Water Quality Study, $25 million, so nearly half of what Springs received. This is a very concerning study because the purpose of it is to allow Florida Gulf Coast University to determine the sources of pollution in the Suwannee, essentially in our agricultural heavy basins, where we already know the sources of pollution. The source of pollution is agriculture. It's in the department's adopted basin management. There is something called the INSILT, which is a model which no one is objected to, as far as I'm aware. And yet we're giving, FGCU nearly half as much money as we're giving Springs to identify the true sources of pollution and recommend regional water quality projects. What this appears to be on its face, and we'll have to see what the actual report comes out with, but as a way to try to delay dealing with the largest source of pollution, agriculture. Right now, the state is redeveloping the basin management action plans for outstanding Florida Springs. And there's a requirement that they at least hit the 5-year goal with their basin management action plans, at least. Very concerning that they may be trying to, say that something besides agriculture, which we know is the source of pollution in that area, is source of pollution, and to develop projects that won't actually deal with pollution. The only way to stop pollution in our area is to stop it at the source. And regional water quality projects, which are usually reservoirs, canals, and things like that, simply aren't going to do that. So this appears on its face to be a pretty big waste of money that actually should be going up to the springs to deal with the issues that we know exist, that DEP has identified, and that need funding. The next one on the list is also a concerning study. This is the IFAS fertilizer rate study at the University of Florida. This is the 3rd year of funding that study. Those of you who have been around a while will remember back in 2020, the Clean Waterways Act was passed into law. And we actually opposed the Clean Waterways Act, but we naively supported one provision, which was that FDACS was going to hire more employees to go around to all the farms and do implementation verification and make sure that folks were actually implementing the best management practices that they said they were. And one of the provisions of that was that they had to collect fertilizer rate data. Well, when they went out and they visited the farms, they found that the farmers were using much more fertilizer than they were allowed to under the best management practices. And as the law was written, they said, well, look, we're going to come back in 2 years. And by the time that happens, you all need to reduce your fertilizer use. Well, instead of doing that, a lot of the big agricultural operations reached out to FDACs, reached out to legislators, and reached out to IFAS and complained and said, now we've got these employees here telling us from FDACs, telling us that we're going to have to reduce our fertilizer use, which is exactly what they need to do. So the next year, Senator Ben Albritton filed a bill that would have allowed farmers to hire certified crop advisors that would have essentially gotten rid of fertilizer best management practices and let the people they hire determine how much fertilizer they're allowed to put on the ground. We were able to defeat that provision in the bill, but had to accept a study at the University of Florida. And there's nothing wrong with studies as long as they're done right, and this one is not being done right. Despite the fact that best management practices, when you implement best management practices, you get a presumption of compliance with all water quality laws. The study is not really taking water quality into account. And in fact, the way it's treating fertilizer is that farmers should be allowed to apply fertilizer all the way up until the very last tomato, very last watermelon, very last pound of potatoes and corn that they can get. And we've already seen when you do a study that way, what the results are going to be, because they've already published their recommendation for corn, which is probably the largest source of pollution up in the Santa Fe and Sewanee area, if you're going to identify one commodity. Right now, and I find this kind of shocking in itself, but right now the best management practice for corn is 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. According to IFAS, they want to increase that to 350 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. The amount of damage that would do to our North Florida springs is hard to imagine. So you can do studies well, you can do them poorly, and depending on how you design the study, which is something Bob can talk about here in a second, you're going to get different results. And the results we're seeing come out of this study are very, very scary. I'm going to take a break. You want to add anything here, Bob, on any of the things I've talked about so far?
Very quickly, because we're 45 minutes in. The previous slide, I had a couple quick comments. The Blue-Green Algae Task Force, $15 million. There was a study done by FSC in conjunction with the Riverkeepers and I think Thousand Friends a year or so ago. The Blue-Green Algae Task Force, which was unveiled a few years ago with great fanfare, came out with 31 recommendations, and this report indicated that so far 4 of those have been met. So they're getting another $15 million. I presume it's to actually figure out how to meet the 27 unmet recommendations out of the 31 there in the original report. The other quick comment on that previous slide, Ryan, $35 million for agricultural BMPs. When we sued on the BMAPs, of course, DEP justified their cleanup plans partly by saying, well, we're going to implement these BMPs in agriculture, and it's going to save us umpty-ump pounds of nitrogen going to the springs. The problem with that is very few of these BMPs have actually been verified to be effective. There's a provision in law that's over a decade old that says all ag BMPs have to be verified at representative sites. That means out in actual fields, out in actual growing conditions. So far, there have been 2. One of them is ferns, and the other one is a minor citrus crop. 2 crops that are really irrelevant in spring areas. So, that provision has never been taken seriously by DEP. It's a classic case when I mentioned early on that we have a list of things that we really need to push the state to do through legal action, one would assume. One of them is this: these BMPs need to be verified because state agencies continue to quote hard and facts numbers on how effective they are. And there's absolutely no proof that they are. So I find that, I don't know what the report language says, Ryan, about where the 35 million is going. But hopefully it's going to verification of some of these, although somehow I doubt it. I think you've covered the fertilizer rate study really well. I just add that we have a couple of emeritus IFAS professors who for 30 plus years were instrumental in developing these current best management practices, these current rate recommendations. And they are both extremely concerned about the direction of this study because they don't think it's scientifically based, statistically well-founded, and a variety of other shortcomings. And these are two PhD emeritus professors who have done this for 30 years, and they don't like the way it's going. So it's not just us. It's people that know what have been involved in this for decades that are very concerned about this. And that's all I've got on this, Ryan. Probably time for questions, huh?
Almost, yeah. And I will say we're really happy to have those PhD folks working with us, but it doesn't take a PhD to know that if you're going to give someone a presumption of compliance with water quality standards, you should probably consider water quality standards when developing the best management practices. The last project I want to highlight is the Chips Hole acquisition project. Back in the summer, FSC worked with some of our local partners near Tallahassee and Sierra Club, including Wakulla Springs Alliance and the Downriver Project, to defeat a comprehensive plan amendment that would have allowed a gas station on top of a cave that's one of the major tributaries to Wakulla Springs. Conservation Florida and Representative Jason Schoaf and a lot of local folks worked hard to put together a legislative budget request for about $4 million to actually purchase that land. So not only would that gas station not go there, but no development would ever go there. Very happy to see that funding came through and that land will be protected and hopefully turned into a nice park for the community. So this is very similar to our victory back 4 or 5 years ago at the Rainbow River, where we managed to stop the development of a large hotel on the river and then see that land conserved. Once again here, able to help stop a gas station that was in a bad place and see that land conserved. So that's a highlight of the budget. Real quick, you can see that there's several $1 million for a number of septic to sewer projects in Homosassa, Kings Bay, Wekiva, and Sewanee. And then finally, a good study. It's always good to have a good study. A good study out of Florida State University to look at innovative ways to reduce pollution at the source in the Wakulla Basin, where their major sources of pollution are urban fertilizer and septic tanks. Wakulla is growing fast and isn't really able to deal with plan for that growth in a way that doesn't jeopardize Wakulla Springs. I know some of the folks are going to be helping run that, and I'm very confident they're going to do a great job. All right, last slide. All right, questions. Okay, so Alice Gardner asks, how do we know they'll actually use the money appropriated for environmental purposes? Anyone who's followed the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, Amendment 1 passed in 2014, can probably understand why that's a good question. I would say for one, this is something that the legislature wants to do. So, it's in law. Obviously, future legislatures could change it, but it would be, pretty controversial once it's done for a future legislative body to come in and say, hey, we don't want to spend this money on the environment anymore. The big difference between this and the LATF is that voters made the legislature do the LATF, and they've never forgiven us for it. And that's why you see the vast majority of that money goes to things that I don't think any of us who supported the amendment or worked on it ever contemplated. Vehicles, insurance, IT, the entire staff of the Forest Service. And I think most of us thought that we were, voting for land conservation funding. Less than 10% of the money actually goes to land conservation funding. But in this case, this is something that the legislature wanted to do. They passed it unanimously. It's a brand new source of funding, unlike the LATF. So it's not taking away from anything that was funded previously. So We always have to make sure they don't go and repeal it or not withstand it in a future budget. But so far, this seems to be the leaders, at least for the next few sessions. This is what they wanted. And I think we, can at least count on 4 good years of funding and hopefully much more from the Gaming Compact. All right. And then Lou asks about a analysis that we did several years ago regarding the current state of springs restoration and funding, where we included, at the current rate that they're going, how long it would take to restore the springs. We do plan to update it. We have not updated it. I can tell you that nothing's changed, much. What we found in that study was that when you try to use infrastructure projects like septic to sewer and wastewater treatment facility construction to solve springs problems, which certainly is the way they've been doing it and the way that I'm afraid that Florida Gulf Coast University study is going to go, it costs about $2,000 to remove a pound of nitrogen once it's in the aquifer. We find that when we do things like land conservation, agricultural cost share, where we address agriculture by preventing that pollution from going into the aquifer in the first place, it costs about $180 per pound per year to keep that pollution out. And then if you look at some of the work Alachua County has been doing on their urban fertilizer ordinances through public education, they have numbers that are much less than that. They're looking at well under $100 per pound to keep pollution out. So, as long as we continue to rely on very expensive infrastructure projects that only address, a small portion of the pollution. I mean, if you just look at it big picture, septic tanks are about 13% of the pollution load. Wastewater treatment facilities are about 3%. So that's about 17% of the pollution going to outstanding Florida Springs is wastewater. Yet that's receiving 95% of the funding, which leaves 70% that is agriculture not being addressed. And as long as our state chooses to do that, and we continue to allow intensive agriculture, and we continue to allow inappropriate development in bad areas, it really is hard to see how we will be able to reach the TMDLs as required to in law within the 20-year time frame that the legislature established in 2016. Bob?
Carry on.
All right. I don't know if we have any other questions. If not, I really appreciate everyone being here for this. I hope you all enjoyed it. This presentation will be up on YouTube and Facebook. If you think this is worth people seeing, feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And, I hope everyone will continue to support the Florida Springs Council's work. I think we had a very effective session in being able to stop some very bad bills, and the state would be a very different place. If it wasn't for advocacy groups like FSC, and, again, we can't do this alone. Those 5,000 contacts that we generated, that really was the difference. And we really do hear from legislators who talk about how effective our member advocacy is. So we've got a little break now. The legislature won't be back until about this time next year. But I really encourage everyone, when you get those emails, you see those social media posts next year, or even this year on the BEAR bill, taking action. We don't just do it to capture your email address or something like that. It is the most effective tool we have. It's the way we can level the playing field with the regulated industry lobbyists in Tallahassee. And, I think we really shocked some people at how effective we were this year up there. Some of the bills that we defeated were strongly supported by the most powerful lobbying groups in the state. So when we all come together and work together, we can really make a big difference. So thank you, everybody. Hope everybody has a great night.